would like to invite our next speaker, Syed Zafar Abbas. As I mentioned, a dear friend of mine, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. If you didn't, you wouldn't have had a place to stay tonight. Without further ado, can I please invite you to the mic?
Thank you for having me and everyone for attending. As a public speaker by profession, there's not many occasions when I get nervous, but when you've had a really amazing talk before you, it is a bit difficult to try and live up to that. I was sitting there while I was listening to Reverend and really lost in what he was saying. That whatever I'm going to say now is obviously going to be off the cuff, and nothing that was originally prepared. Why those of you who've heard me speak before know that what is usually conventional is that speakers generally start with a verse from the Quran or a saying from one of the infallibles. And to tell the truth, I was honestly confused as to what I should pick with such a broad topic and so many to choose from. But there's something that the Reverend said which I've caught on to, and I think it would be a worthy way of trying to get in and add to what he's already brilliantly said. And that is, Imam al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says that human beings are the enemies of what they don't know. So I think I've perhaps read this saying over 50 times, I've spoken about it, I've discussed it with people, and every time I think about it, there's something new that arises in light of this particular saying. And it is that when we don't know about something, when we are ignorant about a particular thing, our general and instinctive reaction is to dislike it. If I've never tried something out before, I instinctively think I won't like it. Which is why generally when you try something for the first time, whether that's something as mundane as, I don't know, something to eat, you're always either pleasantly surprised that you actually like it. And that surprise stems from the fact that you thought instinctively that you wouldn't, because you hadn't tried it before, because you'd never had it before. So you thought, for whatever reason, that you wouldn't like it. And of course, that's a pretty mundane example in terms of whether you would like something or not. But in the greater scheme of things, when we don't know about each other, when we don't know about people who are different to us, we generally have a feeling of animosity towards those people. And instead, when we find out about them, then we realize how much we have in common. I currently work with an organization who go into schools and talk to young people about faith. And the one thing that I notice time and time again, every time I go into a session, and I'm on the panel there with a speaker or speakers from different faiths, or even people from no faith, we always come to an understanding. I always learn something from the young people there, we learn things from each other. But one thing that always comes out, without fail, regardless of what the topic being discussed is how many things that we have in similar with other faiths, compared to how many things are different. And interestingly enough, every time I do a session, every time I come across something or another, I always find that the similarities between faiths are much more. So, as Reverend said, the provocative title of today, the only role model, is obviously, with the question mark. And interestingly enough, if I remember doing a session a couple of years ago, an open day at one of the Islamic centers where they had invited their neighbors and people around to learn more about Islam, and they did an interactive quiz. And one of the questions in the quiz was, who is the only woman who's been mentioned by name in the Quran? And there was a list of options, and one of them was Sarah, and one of them was Mary, and one of them was Hajara, and one of them was Fatima Zahra. And you'll be interested to know that there'd be a session, so there'd be like 10 or 15 people would come in, they'd have a session, they'd do the quiz, and then the next group of people would come in. And every single time, most people would pick Fatima Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet. And they would be in amazement and shock to learn that no, Fatima Zahra had not been mentioned by name in the Quran, but the only woman who'd been mentioned by name in the Quran is actually Mary. And in fact, she's the only woman to have a whole chapter named after her, in addition to being mentioned in the Quran. So that's quite an interesting facet about the religion. In fact, it has been interesting since the beginning of the religion of Islam, when the Holy Prophet sends out his cousin Ja'far, accompanied by 83 other people, to Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, because Muslims are being persecuted in Mecca. And the Meccan envoys come and they speak to the king of Abyssinia, and they say to him, these are our people, you should return them back to us. And he says, no, I'm going to give them protection. And they tell him that, they've left the religion of our forefathers and they've come up with a new religion. So the king of Abyssinia summons Ja'far and he asks him, what is this new religion that you've accepted, and what is this all about? So Ja'far tells him, this is what we used to be, and then this is the religion that we've come to accept. We used to be people who had no respect for one another, we'd fight wars with each other. We were a primitive society, and the Holy Prophet has come and made us respect one another and given us a set of rules by which to live our lives. So the king asks him, he says to him, well, what does your holy book say anything about previous religions? Does it say anything about what we believe in? Because the king of Abyssinia was Christian. And Ja'far recited Surah Al-Maryam. Surah Al-Maryam is very interesting because even though it's named after Maryam alayhi salam, it has a mention of nearly all the prophets that we have in common. So it starts off by talking about, in fact starts off by talking about Zachariah. And it tells us that Zachariah had become old, as you heard in the recitation as well. He'd become old and he didn't have any progeny, and he prayed. He prayed to God and he said, give me a successor, yarithuni wa yarithu min ali Yaqub, who will inherit from me and inherit from the progeny of Jacob. And so God gives him the sign, he gives him John the Baptist. John the Baptist, of course, being a very important personality in Christianity, but also in Islam, because he's very special for many reasons. Just to add to the Middle Eastern touch, does anyone know where John the Baptist is buried?
Syria.
He's buried in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. So again, not in London or Paris or Berlin. So he's blessed with John the Baptist, who has a number of special characteristics about him. The first of them being that he's born of a 6-month pregnancy, and that his name is unique to him, as in there's the Holy Quran says, "Lam naj'al min qablu samiyya." We have given you Yahya, John the Baptist, who has a name nobody was named with before him. In addition to that, the way that he's eventually killed is also a very gruesome tragedy in which he's killed. But in any case, this is something that John the Baptist shares, names that nobody had been named before, and they're both killed in very similar circumstances, and after being killed, their heads being cut off and placed in the respective king's presence as time. In any case, so that's where the chapter of Surah Maryam begins with. And then goes on to talk about, again, the virgin birth. It tells us something very interesting, actually. We heard in the recitation as well, and something that's mentioned in Surah Maryam as well. In the recitation, of course, it was referring to Zakaria, and in Surah Al-Maryam it refers to Maryam. But both of them are exactly the same. That when both of them say, we want a sign from you about this miraculous happening, Zakaria asks that I'm going to have a son, even though according to some narratives I'm 120 years old, and that is not usually what happens. So can I have a sign that this is what is going to happen? And Maryam alayhi salam asks for the same thing when she says, I'm going to have a son, even though no man has touched me. I want to have a sign. And for both of them, Allah gives exactly the same answer. He says, you will not speak to any person for 3 days. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that I struggle to not speak for maybe an hour or two. 3 days is really pushing it. But what this does tell us is that if we want something special to happen in our lives, if we want a sign in our lives, then the virtue of self-control, as in I'm using this simile of not speaking for 3 days, not as a literal not speaking for 3 days, but as a virtue of self-control within me, because obviously not speaking to someone for that amount of time is a particularly difficult skill to master. But if we want something special to happen in our lives, that the virtue of self-control cannot be underestimated. That Allah is saying that, look, I have given certain servants of mine special things. I've broken my own laws that I've created for them to not only make a point, but I've done it for them particularly because they exhibited self-control in their lives. And then there's something about the actual birth itself, because when he's born, the people of Israel say, they accuse Maryam salamullah alayha of exactly the same things that she had feared that would happen. She said, no man has touched me. I have not done anything wrong. So how is this going to happen? And so Allah said, you're not going to speak to anyone for 3 days. And then he's born. And so they say, how have you come with a child, even though your parents were good people? This is something else that's quite interesting, and that is that the value and the importance of good upbringing, as we heard from the Reverend, of what we have as a society today, the value of the mother, but also of the father. That this society is saying that if you want to have a good person, if you want to have a good human being, then it's dependent on having good parents. That your mother and father were not bad people, so it's surprising for us for you to have done something that we imagine is wrong. So she doesn't speak, because obviously there's the promise, you will not speak to anyone for 3 days. And instead she points to the cradle, to which they're very surprised. And they will say, how will the baby speak? 3 hours old, according to the narratives. But he does speak. He speaks and he testifies to the fact that he has been sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a prophet and someone to guide people. Now this is quite interesting because not only as a miracle, as a way of proving the fact that he was a prophet of Allah and someone who had been appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with special powers, but also because it's much easier to understand in today's society where, if I remember correctly, and this was a while ago so it might have gone up, that in today's society 1/3 of the people don't know who their father is. 1/3 of people in the UK don't know who their father is. It may well have gone up. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So it would have been very easy today for any woman who had a baby and didn't know who the father was to say, my son's a prophet, or that he had special powers. So in order to defend the fact that this is actually a miracle, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes sure that if it's a miracle, then the baby is going to do something that is out of the ordinary. The baby is going to do something that ordinary babies don't do. 3-hour-old babies don't talk. So not only is he protecting Isa by him speaking and saying, I'm a prophet and I can speak when I'm 3 hours old, but he's protecting the fact that Maryam alayhi salam has come with a baby, and that is different and very unique to when somebody else or anybody else might come with a baby. But in summary, I think what is, going back to what I started with, that people are ignorant of what they don't know, is that when we learn about other people's faiths, when we learn about what other people believe and who they revere and what their reasons are for doing so, we realize that while there are differences, there's no getting away from the fact that there are certainly differences between people and what they believe in. But what we realize is that the reason why today we have poor role models, the fans waiting for Justin Bieber should have just come to a Muslim event and they would have had to wait for longer than 2 hours. But also because we're ignorant of and we're enemies of what we don't know, of what we're ignorant of. That when we realize that there are people who might have a different belief to us, but they are very much share many values with us, we realize that, well, hold on, why then, if this person has the same values as me, if they believe in the fact that there should be morality in society, if they believe in the fact that there should be respect for the parents, if they believe in the fact, for example, that there should be a good moral conduct in society, a good strong family, as the Reverend mentioned, so on and so forth, then why can I not speak to this person over the things that we have in common and try and work to make those things happen in society so that society is a better place for both of us? And that, I think, is the crux of the issue, and hopefully this event will go in some way in contributing towards trying to achieve this, which is that if we can talk to one another, if we can discuss what we believe in, and if we remove the assumptions and the misconceptions and the misconceived ideas that exist within us which create the animosity, then we realize that when we talk to one another and we work with one another to over these commonalities, that we can really make a greater society instead of the animosity that exists, and we can break down the barriers of hate and animosity that exist, which lead to people acting, unfortunately, in my name, to of killing people, of creating terror in various parts of the world, wherever that might happen to be. But the solution, in my mind, is that we open the door of dialogue, and we say we have differences, but we will be respectful over those differences, and we will seek out the commonalities and realize that there's so much more that we have in common that we can work on to create a better society. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Syed Ahsan. So once again, I'd just like to recap on a few points that Syed just mentioned. The quotes that he opened up with from the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he said, human beings are the enemies of what they don't know. So when we look at that, you then brought in the example of, in terms of, there are different role models that different people have out there, and immediately, if we don't know them, if we haven't looked into them, then we immediately shut off away from them. And instead of doing that, how about we look into them, we kind of break down those kind of misconceptions, as you mentioned, and realise what this person really is, who this person really is. And this will help, again, ensure these bridges between the two faiths and the multiple faiths around there are able to flourish with one another and able to help bring society to a better state than it is at the moment.